My name is Robert Frank. I'm Professor Emeritus in the Université of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. I'm historian, specialized in history of international relations, more specifically 20th century, Second World War, after Second World War, specialist of Anglo-French relations, and also of European integration. That's my main topics, of course. And in international relations, of course, as a historian, I'm very interested in framing ideas, notions, concepts that I may apply or implement even in fields that I know less. I'm not specialist of China, I'm not specialist of Asia, but I try to reflect about these areas in the framework of the history of international relations thinking. Yeah, what is interesting when you think about China, about its place in the world, about its foreign policy since 1978, it's to compare the evolution between Deng Xiaoping, who took power in 1978, and China today with Xi Jinping, who is in power since 2012. And there's the evolution of China itself, and there is the evolution of the foreign policy. I would say that the evolution of China itself is that in 1978, well, China was not in a good situation, not in a good state. I mean, there was all this cultural revolution, who was very important for the Chinese Communist Party, which wanted to unite the youth, who wanted to change things very deeply. But of course, the results were maybe not so good, especially in economy. And it's interesting to see that Deng Xiaoping, who was a real communist, who was a friend of Mao, who attended the long march of Mao in the 30s, how he changed completely the way of thinking the society, the economy of China, and the idea that it had to pass to produce these four modernizations. And among these four modernizations, there was, of course, not only the idea of decollectivization in agriculture, but also to take many methods of capitalism, and to try to build a socialist market economy, which is completely a very big change. And the idea, the aim, the main goal was to first give to the Chinese population well-being, which was not the case in 1978. That maybe the best thing to unite population under the banner of Communist Party was to give this wellness. That's why economy first is a real priority. And why not give some power to China, more power to China, but that means to pass by the economy, and that means not thinking too much to build a political power. Maybe that could be for the future. And if you compare with Xi Jinping, when he takes the power, after Deng Xiaoping you have a few successors, then it's Xi Jinping in 2012, it's maybe the idea that, well, maybe China is ready now to begin a second step. Of course, economy first. Economy is still very important, but why not give a political power also, a cultural power also to China, to make it so that why not the political power, the cultural power could be at the same level than the economic one. Because, well, in 2012 is the moment when China becomes the second great economic power in the world, just behind the United States. So China changed, And of course, the policy changed also, and that's why maybe in diplomacy, you had first a sort of low-profile diplomacy with Deng Xiaoping, and a more positive and why not aggressive diplomacy with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping's idea to build this political power is to have some first allies. Secondly, maybe some ideas of a new international order. And it's in this framework of mind that China wanted to be quite close to other powers. That means Brazil, that means Russia, that means India, and with China, that is the first brick. What is interesting and difficult? It's interesting, it's that will of these countries, but of course China, to have convergence of view, and what is interesting, of course, the convergence of view, that means to try to produce a new international order which would be no more dominated by the West. Okay. I think it's important because after the BRIC will be larger with South Africa, so that will be the BRICS, and afterwards other countries like Egypt, the Emirates, etc., etc. So sort of enlargement of the BRICS. The idea maybe to create what is called the Global South. I think historically it's very important because when you look at the past, you had, of course, a first very interesting attempt in 1955 with the Bandung Conference, the idea of a third world between the West and between the East. And this third world was very, very important because it had a real consequence. It forced the United States, on one hand, it forced USSR, on another hand, to change their foreign policy, to have a more balanced foreign policy, to take into account the third world. And the third world wanted peace. They didn't want any confrontation between East and West. And to seduce the third world, you had a sort of escalation between Americans and Soviets to seduce the third world. And to seduce the third world, you have to have a peaceful language, which was not the case in the first phase of the Cold War, where you had a real political rhetoric confrontation. So the third world had a real historical position, but a real historical weight. But I would say that was good in 1955, it was also in the 60s, a little in the 70s and more in the 80s, we could see a sort of decline of the third world. Why? Because much no more union, a sort of explosion of the third world, etc. So I come back to the global South. The idea that it's maybe time to come back to a sort of unification of the part of the world. Maybe not aggressively against the West, but to show that there's other models, that it's possible to diminish the domination of the West. And of course, in this framework, China has maybe the first place, because China has money, China has some power, and is able with this new Silk Road, etc., to invest in infrastructures and ports and much help. And that means maybe a new model. When America invests, you have often the idea that America wants a political compensation. Of course, we don't have to be naive. China would be the same thing, but the constraints seem less. That means that the idea put forward by the Chinese, we help, but we don't want to interfere in domestic affairs. Is it too idealistic? That's another problem. But anyway, the speech is that, and of course, it's a speech which can seduce when you compare with the American speech. And of course, it will maybe have some consequence on the American speech, because the Americans can understand that the Chinese method could seduce many countries. As the Chinese method is to try to convince other states of the South that Western domination has to diminish. It's a speech based on peace, okay? And of course, Confucianism. Confucius, it's 6th century before Christ and the beginning of the 5th century before Christ. He had, of course, a philosophy based on harmony, order in the society, order in the family, respect for the parents, but all that in a harmonious system for peace. Peace inside, peace outside. Of course, this Confucianist philosophy, you can interpret it in a very conservative manner. Order, family, etc., etc. That's why in the 20th century you had many signs of rejection of Confucianism. In 1919, the students who protest, they will protest also against Confucianism. And of course, the Communist Party, 2 years afterwards, in 1921, when it will be created, will also reject Confucianism. And when the Communist Party comes into power, a few decades later, in 1949, it will be a rejection of Confucianism. And during the Cultural Revolution in 1966, 1976, it will be worse. Confucius will be completely rejected as a conservative, a reactionary philosophy. And what is quite interesting and surprising is how Deng Xiaoping, in a small measure, but really in a very big proportion, a big measure by Xi Jinping after 2012, 2013, Confucianism will be very important. Confucius is back in China. And of course, it's not the conservative dimension that will be taken in account, but of course the dimension of peace. We have to prove that we are peaceful, that this harmony, we want to build it inside China, thanks to economy, but economy can be peaceful, and of course outside China, as we have a foreign policy more, well, they would say positive, we could say aggressive, we have to reassure all the world, and why not the West also, that even if we have a political will of more influence, of more power, it's in a peaceful way. That's why Confucius is very well used, why not instrumentalized to make that. But what I think interesting is that in one hand you have instrumentalization. In one hand, you could say, well, maybe all that is propaganda. Maybe all that we have to be careful. Maybe all that, this peaceful Confucianist foreign policy is hiding some sort of aggressivity behind that. And you have some threats on Taiwan, etc., etc. But on another hand, what is very interesting when you go to China, that this new Confucianism is, in my opinion, quite internalized by Chinese society. So, on one hand, you could say, well, that's maybe we could feel optimistic. That means that even if it's instrumentalized, even if Xi Jinping, or why not his future successor, become more aggressive, maybe you will have in the society some restraint to all that. But of course, we never know, because if when there's a big social crisis, a big economic crisis in China, we know by lessons of history that when you have a crisis, when you have a real problem of economy, a state can become aggressive. That's maybe the case of Russia, which is weak and aggressive because of its weakness. But for China, because of this economic power, because I would say of the use of economy in foreign policy. When you invest money, when you invest for infrastructures, for ports, for highways, for railways in foreign, that means that, of course, it can be aggressive because you have more influence, but it's not so aggressive than armaments. It's not so aggressive. So I would say that economy is also a tool to have more power outside, some arms, to have a sort of peaceful arms, to have more power and influence outside, and that is the big weakness of Russia. Russia has no that, has no these tools. So you can compare how the Russian government wants to unite its population on the idea of national identity, of national pride, but how to do that when you don't have the means to have an economic influence outside. China also wants to have to unify its population behind national identity, national pride. Why not, just like Russia, in a sort of imperial view? That means that Tibet is Chinese, and there's no discussion about that Taiwan should be in our republic. In fact, just like Putin wants that Ukraine is Russian, etc. But for China, that's maybe an optimistic point of view. Why using arms? Why waging war? When we may do things differently, thanks to economy. So so on one hand we can be optimistic, but as I say, you cannot predict what can happen if there is a crisis. If there's a crisis, any country can become aggressive because of that. Another difference between China of Deng Xiaoping and China today is that during the era of Deng Xiaoping, to promote economy, to realize, to obtain a real economic growth, a real modernization, China had to imitate. China was quite dependent on technology coming from the West. Now, it's nearly the reverse. Now, China has obtained a real superiority in matter of technology in many fields. And AI, artificial intelligence, in semiconductors, in automation, in many fields. And that means that, of course, China can be independent in the technology field, and why not export things? But there's another dimension which is very important, is that this new technology, I would say based on the fourth industrial revolution, needs some materials which are not so easy to obtain, which are quite rare in the earth. Or you have the rare earth elements, but you have also the lithium, you have also all what is necessary to produce the semiconductors, microprocessors, and China is there quite aggressive, I would say, not only in producing that, but in controlling all the chain of production, of exportation, etc., etc. And that is one of the main tensions between America and China. The sort of competition between China and America to control all the chain of production, of distribution of these elements, very important for all this technological revolution we are living now. And that's why when I say China is peaceful, yes, it seems like, but also China can be aggressive, not only facing Taiwan, not only in the Spratly Islands dispute, not only in the Parcels dispute, but that's quite local. But in a global, scale, China is very aggressive on these materials, and that makes Americans quite worried. But of course, in the other sense, Chinese can say yes, but if it's the Americans who control that, we can be quite worried. So there you have a real confrontation between the two main powers in the world.